Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And today we would like to process the results of the election before the election has taken place. So you might be wondering what that means exactly. And that means that we are about a week out from the United States election when we recorded this podcast. And the reason that we're doing this is because we're thinking that this might give us a bit more of a balanced way to think strategically, critically, and Christianly about how to live in the moment in which you find yourself on the Friday or whenever it is that you listen to this after the election. A couple things could happen. So Trump could win, Harris could win, or there's also a pretty high chance that we don't know who won at the time in which this podcast is released. That's happened multiple times in our past where Florida's been counting hanging chads or whatever. You know, there's some sort of system, something where the electoral college is close, or it comes down to disputed counts or something within specific counties or something like that. So maybe we don't know at this point, but you will know soon. And the thing that has been obvious and that Cameron and I have mentioned for quite some time is that we're in such a contentious time that whatever the outcome of this election is, half of the country is going to be upset about it. And that's, and not just like sad, but mad, and like maybe even in an activist sense, mad about it. So who knows how this is going to work out. But there's a part of this that Cameron has been hammering on for the last, like, I don't know, Cameron, 2 or 3 years about this being our culture and us getting the officials and the representation we deserve, that he said has largely fallen on deaf ears. And I'm wondering if, Cameron, if now is the time in which some of what you have been talking about here will become more obvious to us when we step back and recognize that you literally got the president that your culture produced and that the system is designed to bring about, and that you are implicated in the culture that formed this outcome. So we're all in this together. And that's an uncomfortable truth, I think. Let me throw one story out here, Cameron, as a framing device, and then get you to weigh in here. When I was a kid, our family had a rooster who had like a 3-year-long battle with our dog. So we had this chocolate lab named Max and this cranky old rooster named Buzz. He was all black, looked like a buzzard. That's how he got his name, Buzz. And they were each other's main entertainment for literally like 3 years. And just all the things that they got up to were hilarious. But there was one particular move that Buzz had, is he would run and then step through the bottom rung of a farm gate. So it's like an 8-inch gap, and the dog couldn't fit through it. So he would stand right by the gate. The dog would come running, and then right as the dog was about to grab him, he would step through the bottom gate, which, I mean, he's making like a 4-inch step. But that meant that the dog had to turn around and run across the field, through the apple trees, across the field in front of the barn, around the barn, jump over a fence, come all the way back around to where the rooster was standing on the other side of the gate. And right when he got to the rooster would make that same 4-inch step back through the bottom of the gate. And so the dog ran like 300 yards and the chicken moved like 4 inches. And, you know, the rooster, just by doing this little stepping back and forth through the bottom of the gate, could totally exhaust the dog, because the dog was have to run these huge laps in both directions. And the rooster was just using that dividing line to protect himself either way. And so I think there are elements and things like that we do with our own identity, that there are these very little short steps we can make to protect ourselves. Or you're trying to, or you're on the other side of this where you're trying to chase the chicken, and it's exhausting because it only has to move a little bit to protect itself and to give you a lot more work. And so what are some of these moves that we make, is that rather than leaning into this idea that, you know, I'm an American and we're all in this together, e pluribus unum when it's convenient, but then when something happens that I don't, then I'm going to switch and say, well, I'm part of this political party, or I'm not part of the political system, and so it's this switching back and forth about how we primarily identify ourselves that gives us this facade of protection, and we don't want to have to deal with the consequences of the culture that we help create by living in. We can just dodge in and out of that. So maybe a bit of a complex analogy, but I always think of that mental image when I look at the short things that we can do to protect ourselves that aren't really allowing us to deal with the consequences of the situation that we actually live in. I was guessing that you're probably not thinking about dogs chasing chickens in your analysis. So let's bring it back around to the more meta literary level. Take us from here.
Certainly not thinking about roosters and dogs, but I love it. It's delightful. It's helpful. It's very clear. Well, I started thinking about this seriously, really in putting it into writing in probably around 2018. That's when I started working on a book with my dad called Faith That Lasts. So this is 2 years after 2016, the momentous election of Donald Trump. And I had been thinking a lot about in 2015 and in 2016, I had been thinking a lot about how this would change the public perception of theologically conservative Christians. And I was not the only one. Many of us were deeply concerned about that. But I will say, so by way of introduction here, Nathan, I was on a podcast, and this was a smaller podcast, and I was kind of doing a favor for a friend. And the person asked me, what are some of the major challenges to the Christian faith? This was an apologetics-oriented discussion. And I brought up, so the podcast would have been in 2015. So this is pre the election of Trump now. I'm just jumping all over dates here. And I said, well, I think the Christian support of a candidate like Donald J. Trump, and I'm not saying there aren't legitimate, people don't have legitimate reasons to vote for Trump, of course. But I said, I think the support of him is going to cause some serious damage to the prophetic witness of the church. What was interesting was this was before everybody was talking about this. And so the host was caught way off guard and didn't really know how to respond to that. And I actually thought afterwards that they would cut that whole segment from the podcast itself. And they almost did, actually. But in the end, they opted to leave it in there. But what I was leading up to was a sentence that actually made it into the book, which is, if our culture is indeed in precipitous decline, we are most certainly numbered in that decline. So a couple of ways to say that. We have both of the candidates that we have this election, and let's face it, we've had several elections with abysmal candidates. Most people would admit that in both parties. But we also have to say, I think any honest person would say that these candidates are near perfect reflections of the state of the culture. They represent a high level of decadence. Now, they're not symbols. I mean, they function symbolically in some ways, but we're also talking about human beings here. Donald J. Trump is a person. Kamala Harris is a human being. But I'm talking about also what their party represents, the tactics that they deploy in their strategies and trying to win an election. All of that speaks to a cultural moment that is, I think we use a lot of words. We'll use words like chaotic and very contentious, very polarized, all of that. But that's true, and it's describing all of us. And that's the message that I am finding, Nathan, continues to be a hard sell, because many Christians, not all, but many Christians are starting to play the grievance game. And you've talked about this before on the podcast. We've brought this up, but they're drawing from that same playbook. As Christians become more marginalized, we're being, people hate us. I'm hearing that phrase all the time. I want to vote for somebody who doesn't I don't like this person, but at least they don't actively hate me. So we're being marginalized. So we need to, and we're trying to fight desperately to get our voice heard. And because of that, we're going to resort to some extreme measures in the sense that we're going to do things, we're going to vote in ways that we wouldn't under ideal circumstances. But this is not an ideal world, so the saying goes. So we're going to do things that we would not otherwise do, but we have to protect ourselves. We have to fight back. And what's ironic about that is we're fighting back with using the same tactics that the wider culture is using, which is I've I'm borrowing from James Davison Hunter. I'm going to argue as a nihilistic playbook that's being used. I'm not saying we're all nihilists. I'm saying that when we basically think, well, talking things through is dead. It's not going to work anymore. It's a wasted strategy, and it depends on a level of stability that we no longer have. So now what we have to do is win and destroy our opponents. I'm saying that that's nihilistic. That's you annihilate your opponent.
Yeah, can I put some just examples on this? If you're like, what are you talking about? So let's think about the a phrase that could go either way. So you there was a time in which you would see people with a okay, let's go this direction first. So Trump is not my president after the 2016 election.
Right.
Or Biden isn't my president after the 2020 election. No, they are. Like if you live in a country that elects an official and there's an inauguration. So that's a non-religious version of this, just to put a finger on that, of saying, like, no, you as an individual don't get to decide who the president is if the country elects, the electoral college process works, and there's an inauguration. So there's I guess, Cameron, maybe the first place to start, if you're a Christian processing what just happened, is there is a bit of a deal with it principle at play here, right? You need to accept that this is what happened. And I think there's been struggles with that in the past few elections that are really unhealthy. To say, okay, here's what happened. And the reason that it's important that you deal with it and process that is, if you don't like what happened, you won't be able to fix it by not acting like that's the system that's at play here. So there's an odd, like, I'm going to step through the fence and I'm an American and the system is correct. And then the system doesn't produce what I like. And then I'm going to step back through the bottom of the fence and say, well, I'm an individual and this doesn't apply to me. And like, you can't have it both ways here. You're either going to be really, really in on the political thing and take the consequences. It's like you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You love politics, you die by politics. Like you gotta, if you're going to have a public face in this, where you're posturing at least that some of your hope for the future is based on the political system, then you need to live with the consequences of the thing that you built. So that's step one. I think, not even as a religious element, that applies to everybody. Is like, okay, here's what I was hoping for. It either did or didn't happen. And now where do we go from here?
And just to illustrate your point, Nathan, so that line, not my president, the first time I actually heard that, and I'm curious, I mean, maybe this is true for you too, was actually with the election of Barack Obama.
Yeah.
That's when I started hearing that.
Obama's where I heard it first. Yeah.
That's where I heard it first. So, and I think,
well, let's just be equal opportunity. Like, this is not a partisan issue, is what Cameron and I are pointing out here. Both sides have done this. Yeah. That's the main takeaway. And I'm saying that neither of those are healthy or right.
No, in fact, that's a pretty lawless statement on the face of it, and a dangerous one, actually. At that, it's quite subversive, and in a moment where the social stability is already so weak, making statements like that is actually dangerous. You're contributing to we talk a lot about, you use the word chaotic a lot. Chaos, that's contributing to that chaotic atmosphere. So, part of the issue.
There's one, yeah. Well, let me throw one more out here that I also hear that is not right. Jesus is not your president. Whoever just got elected is your president. Jesus is not running for office, and that's not a democratically elected position, nor does that bear into the partisan political narrative of how you want to frame. So don't jump into a category that doesn't exist as some sort of framing device to feel like that shelters you politically from all the activities that you've been involved in. So let me just chop that off.
Let me interject something here. Yeah, and well, on that note, let's interject something here too. So we hear a lot about idealism, and we may be accused of being idealistic here, Nathan. Well, this it's not a perfect world, it's not an ideal world, so therefore we have to go with what works. Well, we can also say, yes, it's not an ideal world, it's a fallen world. So in a sense, when you see decadence and corruption in a culture, you can be sad and not surprised. There's your line there, Nathan. But also, you can make your peace with it. Doesn't mean you do nothing. It's not a recipe for quietism, but you don't need to be driven to extremes, so to speak. So when we resort to extreme measures, that really is a mark of despair as well. So I've used the word nihilistic, and nihilism, by the way, and despair those are closely related. They're very connected. I mean, at the heart of nihilism is the assumption that really nothing means anything. There's no real intrinsic meaning to anything. And so there are a number of different ways to spin that out that can take you in a despairing direction, but it also can take you in a direction where, and this is Nietzsche is the guy who says this basically, but where you just recognize, all right, it's a battle of the wills then. Nothing really at its heart means anything, so let's just fight and get our way and make sure that we get what we want. And by default, many of us are being pulled into that line of thinking right now. And it makes sense, again, because we are in a period of cultural decadence, and social stability is very fragile. But I think sometimes there's a little bit of wounded idealism happening here among many believers, where they think, how could it come to this place? How could we reach a place like this? How does this come to pass? How can we be here? I remember when times were better. And I'm very sympathetic to that, but also because, again, you do live in a fallen world, and America is a big grand experiment, and has been for a long time deeply addicted to hyper individualism and a vision of freedom that's almost purely negative. So we've come to a place now where we have a very hard time controlling ourselves when we don't get what we want. And so that's why I think any kind of real serious, I'll pause there for a second.
Let me throw something out here. So I guess the question to ask ourselves is, whose fault is it when things don't turn out the way that we want them to? And how do we respond to that? So what's our responsibility on the other side of that? So there will be people who are feeling deep despair. I mean, so despair comes from unmet expectation. So you'll have a lot of people who are really deeply committed to one candidate or the other winning, and you can hear the extreme rhetoric on both sides of people thinking like this is an existential threat and crisis. But this goes back to, 2015, if Trump wins, I'm moving to Canada. Like people are saying that kind of stuff always. Yep. And there's actually a real, it really highlights a deep sense of distrust in our democratic, representative democracy, of saying like, is the system stable enough to handle a crazy process, a crazy character? Half of the stuff that the candidates promise, they can't even do as president. Like the system isn't designed for that. So let's have a little bit of faith in maybe the genius of the founding fathers in setting up some checks and balances here. So there's that thing going on. But just to finish this thought, Cameron. So the other day, one of my kids dropped, I think it was like 18 eggs down our basement steps. I don't know when the last time you threw a dozen and a half eggs down your basement stairs. I mean, they tripped and fell with an open egg carton. Like it wasn't whose fault was it? Like, okay, maybe your rubber boots were a little bit too big or something, and whatever. So how are you going to process that? Okay, there's nothing ideal about that situation, and that's literally a multi-level difficulty. So you can get mad, you can fly off the handle, you can look to who you're going to blame. Why aren't you more responsible? Or you can say, okay, let me show you how to make some. We're going to take some steps. Again, the puns just keep working on this. We're going to take some steps to like figure out how to solve this problem.
There you go.
Right?
Yep.
See that? See what I did there? And so it's like, okay, 18 broken eggs down your stairs is not good. Let's agree to that. And it's the breaking of something that could have been good for another purpose. But how you respond to that says a whole lot about who you are. And so I think if you're in the half of the country who feels like, it's a total dumpster fire and all your eggs just got broken and poured down the steps, how you find yourself responding to that It's like I tell my kids, you can work or you can whine, right? So you can whine or you can do something, but you have to feel like you're implicated in it in order to feel like you have a real responsibility and something that you can meaningfully do as a productive contribution to the community and the country in which you live using your Christian foundations and values. You have to implicate yourself in it to do something meaningful to fix it. And so you can't implicate yourself in it just in the constructive ways. You have to implicate yourself in it. And sometimes you end up with egg on your steps. There's no tidy or non-egg breaking way to be involved in this world, even if you recognize that you're not of it. So be consistent, I guess, is what I'm trying to remind myself here on. Yes, things are bad, but if we have a real role, it means we're part of it, which means here we are together in this. You can either choose to hide or ignore or to rant or scream or yell, but at the end of the day, somebody's got to pick up the eggs.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, a few observations, and then I want to try to take this in a genuinely encouraging direction. But yes, the state of our culture, look, we all have a hand in it. That's just the cold, hard truth, and we need to admit it. So I am deeply suspicious of any kind of argument, any kind of scheme that terminates in an us and them kind of scenario. That's one of the major problems of our thinking these days. So much so that, remember Jonathan Haidt and is it Mark Lukianoff? I always get the name wrong. Greg Lukianoff
maybe.
Or Mark Lukianoff. We'll look it up.
I think it's Greg. I think it's Greg.
So in the coddling of the American mind, they actually, and neither of these gentlemen are Christians, by the way, but they both pointed out that one of the great untruths of our age, well, they said among university students, but this is not limited to university students anymore. And I forget when that book came out, but it was a while ago. But they said is that the belief that life is a battle between good and evil people. Friends, not virtually all, many, I would say the majority of the political arguments I've seen from both sides do this. They say the other side is evil. The other side is a, fascist dictator, tyrant. The other side is a godless, wicked person who wants to mutilate our children, kill our children. Right. So I'm not saying that policy isn't important. I'm not saying that these aren't crucial issues. They are. They're all very important. But let's bear in mind that we're still dealing with human beings. And if we are indeed Christians, we recognize that evil is not a problem for other people. It's all of our problem. It's it's our problem of evil. And so similarly, it's not the culture or the media or, the progressives or the alt-right. Just pick pick the outgroup, pick your repugnant cultural other. It's our culture. It's us. So we have to take some ownership. We have a hand in our culture and where we're at today. And so there's truth to we have the candidates we deserve. So we need to take ownership of that, not so that we can walk around like puddle glums and feel all horrible and destitute all day long. No, but just so we can take ownership. There's a difference between walking around in shame or morbid introspection and another being allowing genuine conviction to do its good work in your heart and life so that you can be an agent of change. Here's the other observation I want to make. I'm not saying a presidential election isn't important. Of course it is, but neither of these candidates can undo by themselves the state of our culture, the nihilistic moment in which we find ourselves. None of them, they can't reverse it. That's where Nathan and I don't sound like idealists. That's Nathan. I think you have a way of putting it, saying, we're actually more pessimistic than you. We don't think that either one of these candidates can make a big difference on where we're at right now. Now, what's encouraging about that, Cameron? So here's the encouraging note. It starts deep, real cultural change. The word I've been gravitating toward, Nathan, is rebirth. I like that cultural rebirth. This was something that was very discussed among a certain group of intellectuals during and right around the Second World War. So these would be people like Simone Weil, T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot had a lot to say about rebirth. W.H. Auden, and of C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. These people were considering a world in crisis, in very, very deep crisis. But they were also animated by real hope. But, a unifying kind of theme among people in these kinds of circumstances, and this goes back to the founding fathers as well, is that what is needed in these times for deep, lasting change is virtue, the cultivation of virtue, and it's a long game. This is likely something you won't see in your lifetime. To bring about that kind of deep change, because it doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with cultivating a sense of virtue. The founding fathers didn't use the word virtue as much. They preferred the self-governing word, but that's what they mean by that. And that's where Christians, we have a real advantage, not because we're better, but because we follow the one who has the words of life. And so because we follow the true master of human life as it is meant to be, and we can live that out prophetically together as his people and under the inspiration and guidance of his Holy Spirit, we can lead the charge in virtue. And that starts, the reason that's encouraging is that's in your homes, that starts in your neighborhoods, that starts in your churches. Be the hands and feet of Christ where you are, and it's enough. And it will matter way more than showing up at the polls, way more. It will matter way more than your local elections. Not saying those things are important, but this is more important.
And it is, because what it allows you to do is it gives you something to do other than just share memes for the next 4 years while you're getting ready to vote the next time. That's not really
and contribute more to the rage and
that's what everybody needs
of the atmosphere.
That's what
you're doing. Yeah, right.
Right. So let's talk practically a second. You were saying there isn't an us and them. That isn't true politically, but it is true spiritually and biblically. Jesus does make those distinctions of who's for him and who's against him. But those are in religious and virtuous and moral categories, not in political identities. And so that frees us up in the way we think about where the boundaries actually are for dividing who is for the things of God and who isn't. Throw that out there. What does it practically mean to pursue this idea of virtue, as Cameron was putting out there? Maybe the baseline for that. So obviously, as Christians, they're the clear examples of being conformed to the image of Christ is the goal there. But if you wanted a slightly more secular take on how you might discuss that with somebody, is to say, pursue the things that you can live with the consequences of, and speak things that you are sure are true that you're willing to deal with the consequences of. I think that's where I'm. So the rooster would taunt the dog, but didn't want the consequence of dealing with the dog, right? So pursue the things that you're willing to live and die for the consequences of them being right or wrong. And so you don't complain when it doesn't happen. You say, yeah, this is where this was actually going. I like that about Israel in the Old Testament, that they hit certain points in which they're like, this is miserable. God said it would be, and we brought this upon ourselves. I'm trying to do that in my personal life too, in our household, of like, who spilled this, who left this out, or dropping and breaking something, of verbally saying, well, that was a mistake, or that didn't pan out, or I wish I hadn't done that. Just on a small scale of taking responsibility for the things that I do that are clearly not bad. So rather than immediately trying to blame somebody else for the state of my office, which is abysmal right now. I can't even see my desk under all the books and papers right now.
Hey, likewise.
So part of it is just taking responsibility of saying, this is on me. But also having the responsibility to say, I can do something about this. So we're going to pursue the things that we can live with the consequences of. We're going to speak truth about things that we really think are true and that we're really sure of. And we're not going to slander, because that's a big biblical no-no along the way. And then here's an odd Christian one, is that we're called to pray for our leaders. And that's easier to say, I think, Cameron, before this election, because it's too close to call, and neither of us have an idea of who's going to come out on the other side of this. So it's good that we have these kind of eternal reminders, biblically speaking, that don't have like footnotes of exemption clauses in them. So we're going to desire the good of our country. We're going to pray for our leaders, which I think when you bring yourself to pray for your leaders, you're inherently saying that there's somebody in control who isn't the leader. Like there's so many interpretations that give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. But one of the big ones is that Jesus is just saying, just remember, Caesar isn't God. So when you pray for your leaders, you're willing what's good for them in the eyes of the Lord, but you're also reminding yourself that your leader is not the master of reality.
God.
And so there's something very good for the other and a good reminder for ourselves that places us on that footing when we follow the biblical command to pray for our leaders. So I think it's the small steps in our lives. Clean up the broken eggs as you see them around you. Recognize that you have a phenomenal amount of responsibility, especially if you're a Christian. You have a deep sense of how things ought to be in the categories of human value and distinctives and what's possible. So we should be dreaming big. We should be building good things. We should be looking across fences for ways that we can help out. We should have a very high vision of human agency because we believe that we're created by God to have a massive impact in shaping the world and the culture around us. That's a mandate that we get from the beginning of Scripture through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So whoever the candidate is right now, none of those put Christians on the back foot. We lean into what it is that God has for us here. And we do this by day being faithful to what God has asked us to do. Recognize that the church is God's A plan for the way in which he's going to engage the world. We study, we find, we learn out, we grow, and we're shaped and formed within that, and we contribute to it. And we spend time in prayer, reminding ourselves who's really in charge of the world, and then listening to discern what our responsibilities are in light of that, all shaped and guided by the Holy Spirit as we study the Word together. And so in doing so, I think that helps us take a deep breath, draw the lines of distinction where they actually are, but also in places where we draw ourselves within the boundary of really needing to take responsibility for some of the broken things we see, but also needing to take responsibility with joy for the things that we have a part in reshaping and refining and renewing and reviving, because a lot of good things are going to happen in the next 4 years, regardless of who's president. I like, the Dave Ramsey line where somebody said, which candidate is going to be best for the economy? And he said, I found ways to make money under all administrations. Your financial outlook has 95% what to do with what happens in your house and 5% with what happens in the White House. And I think for the church and for the Christian, the same thing is true. Your capacity to lead a God-honoring life and for your church to grow and to engage the culture around you has way more to do with what happens internally than what happens externally at this junction in history. So let's be critical and pessimistic about false gods and things that aren't good sources of hope. And let's be honest about what our responsibility is there if we're people who claim to have a vision for what it is that God wants and lean into that with joy, even when it's difficult. We're going to continue exploring this for the rest of our lives, and you're welcome to follow along and listen in as we try to work this out. We're not saying we're masters of this. Thinking out loud is an invitation to literally think out loud as we try to process and make sense of what we see happening in the world around us. And we're grateful for those of you who do that with us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, the podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.